Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy. Joining me for this episode is my colleague Anupam. Hi Anupam, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hey Sarthak, absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so Anupam has recently written a long and a detailed piece on India's trade policy. This article is titled From Protectionism to Global Integration, India's Trade Policy Before and After 1991. This is part of the 1991 project initiative of the Mercatus Center, George Mason University. We'll share the URL of the article along with this episode. So in this episode, as you would have guessed, we are going to discuss about India's trade policy, its evolution, different shortcomings. And before we start, I have a quick announcement. The applications for our September 2022 GCPP cohort is open. And if you're applying before 23rd July, you'll be eligible for 10% early bird scholarship. So let's get started. So Anupam, you have written a long piece, right? So can you just, in Takshashila style, in that reverse Bollywood format, can you just give us a summary of what this article is all about?
Okay, trade policy was terrible. It was then reformed in 91 and we were okay for some time. Some reforms happened. Now we are reverting back to pre-91 days. Okay,
that was interesting. Okay, so I went through the entire article and one thing that I came across was, what I realized was the focus of India's trade policy, in fact, at that point of time and to a large extent now, has typically been on addressing the symptoms rather than the root cause. Right? For instance, right? So we did not have enough foreign exchange reserves, and one of the possible solution could have been was to augment your resources, right? Increase your reserves. But our focus was on managing whatever little resources that you have, controlling how these resources can be managed in a better way. At least that's what was thought. So why is this the case, right? Why the focus is mostly on addressing the symptoms rather than the root cause?
well, I cannot really point to why they were doing that, but that's an interesting take on our overall approach back then. If you look at trade policy, our industrial policy, if you look at the way we went about in labor laws, etc., I think there was a particular mindset that ruled all of our policy making decisions, and this has got a sort of part dependence. This is dependent on where we came from. This is just post-colonial India. Once we kind of got independence, we naturally lent a particular a particular way in terms of our policy making, right? We were not necessarily very keen on opening up our markets, inviting foreign companies, on opening up trade, because we felt that we were again going to be exploited. So remember, we had a terrible experience with the East India Company, which started off as a trade. This thing, I think the scars kind of remain when we just got independent, and therefore we became slightly protectionist right at the get-go. Right, just after independence, we got quite protectionist, and that carried on. And so we were a country with, as you mentioned, with kind of limitations in foreign exchange. We didn't have a lot of forex, and that thus every single bit of trade policy was centered around how do you save this foreign exchange, how do you allocate this foreign exchange, how do you preserve this foreign exchange, and then how do you best use this foreign exchange, right? So there was very little thought given to saying how can we augment this foreign exchange. Somehow we probably had little faith and belief in our own abilities to take on the rest of the world, be competitive, and therefore export more and earn foreign exchange. So we started off on this back foot. We started off being defensive, which meant that instead of really saying that let's go ahead and compete with the world and earn foreign exchange, it was more about how do you kind of preserve this foreign exchange. So once you start off with that, the entire kind of public policy around trade is completely determined and directed by this need to preserve your scarce foreign exchange, right? So what would happen, and this is a funny kind of take, I mean, now it seems funny, but it almost tragic. What would happen is that, the Ministry of Finance would prepare an estimate of how much forex you have now and how much forex you would possibly have in the next 3 to 6 months, right? And once you do that, then you would have to start allocating that forex. Okay, so this is a highly planned economy, right? It's not something which is, we'll leave it to the market and I'm sure we'll get foreign exchange. It is not like that at all. Instead, it was on how do you, allocate and preserve this. So what would happen is that in the first stage, that scarce foreign exchange would first go towards debt repayment because you don't want a default. So whatever debt that India had, that would be the first priority. Then embassy expenditures. Obviously, India, just become independent. You had all of these embassies around the world that required foreign exchange. Then high priority items were food, fertilizer, because we are, obviously agricultural economy. So those would get precedence. Petroleum and oil, the same problem as of now. We are entirely dependent on oil imports, right? So all of this, and of course, defense needs. So if you needed to import weapons or anything, all of these would get the first priority in kind of allocating foreign exchange. Next, you would try to look at public sector undertakings. Remember, again, India at that time, you have to look at all of these things in parallel, right? Not just trade policy, but you have to look at industrial policy as well. And industrial policy was largely led by big government undertakings, public sector undertakings. So they would get priority in the allocation of foreign exchange. So if your BEL and BHEL and whatever needed foreign exchange to import some capital goods, they would get priority over anybody else. Then iron and steel would get priorities. Finally, the leftover bits and pieces were given to the Commerce Ministry to then allocate it amongst the private industry, right? And even there was various kinds of
Rules, regulations,
rules and
categorization.
regulations, categorization. Absolutely. So capital goods would get top priority, intermediate goods last. Second, and then finally consumer goods would get like the least amount of priority for this thing. So ultimately, if you were an individual customer, consumer who wanted to import something, I don't think there would be anything left at all in that stage for you to have, right? So this was how that kind of complex system of foreign exchange controls were done.
And I mean, when you are talking about all these things, right? This thought just comes to my mind. Just imagine you are just expecting that some bureaucrat at the top will be able to decide all these things, right? How can you make these estimates? It's not that easy to make these estimates, right?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think the amount of. So here is where I find a strange paradox, right? So as I was saying, there was very little confidence in Indian industry, entrepreneurs, etc., that they would go out and produce things and compete with the world. But at the same time, there was an inordinate, disproportionate amount of confidence laid at the hands of the bureaucrat who could estimate all of these things, who could correctly allocate and so on. So it's a paradox of sorts. So the amount of kind of confidence in self, which is the government at this stage, was extraordinarily high that they could plan all of these things, right?
And one more thing here. So again, as you mentioned, there's this assumption that someone at the top will be able to estimate these things, plan these things. But I find it weird because if you look at the policies, right, there doesn't seem to be much clarity in terms of the goals and objectives, right? As you have also mentioned in your paper, that trade policy we had, but the focus of the trade policy might not have been on increasing trade. Rather, the focus of the trade policy would have been on increasing revenues.
Correct. So there was this is a very strange thing. So there was no clarity on what exactly you wanted to achieve with that trade policy. And in fact, if you look at some of that trade policy there was very little attention paid to how can India's share of global trade increase, right? Whether it's exports, definitely, I mean, they were not looking at increasing imports, but at least even increasing exports, being integrated with the global economy, etc., got very little attention. In fact, most of the attention was on two or three things, right? One, how do you control? And so again, don't look at trade policy in isolation, but look at trade policy in kind of conjunction with your industrial policy, with MRTP, with labor laws, etc. All of that had, predominantly on how do you control private enterprises, right? And along with that control meant that, of course, how do you control the resources that would go to private enterprises. So, and foreign exchange was that scarce resource, right? So it was about control on one hand, and on the other hand, definitely, I mean, revenue. So you look at entire, and I'll come to this later, but the entire trade policy had two components to it. One was on the import licensing system, and the other was the tariff system. So it very neatly actually divides into what you were saying. The entire import licensing system was on control, right? How do you basically control the entire private industry and private citizens importing? And the entire tariff system was on how do you raise revenues, right? And so, I mean, the peak tariff rate at one point was above 400%. So that was just purely to raise revenue, right? And so you had, the strange thing, but very little attention was actually toward what mattered most, which is how do you, increase trade. That you would assume that would be the primary objective of trade
Trade
policy.
policy. Yeah, and in fact, this is what also gets reflected in the way policies were initiated. And many times, what used to happen was a policy is initiated, but then they will back down, right? So the policy reversal used to be also quite frequent.
Correct.
And mostly, what will happen if you're moving one step ahead? Again, it's not that liberalization started only in the 90s. There have been some steps before that also. But if you're moving one step forward, then there will be something, and then you will move two steps backward.
Yeah. This happened quite a lot, and it's quite frustrating. I mean, if you were a neutral observer of India's trade policy, and especially one who were prone to advocating for freer trade, it would have been an extremely frustrating time. So in the 50s, actually, it was interesting that there was actually quite a buildup of forex reserves due to the war, due to whatever the British government did, etc., which we need not get into. There was a gradual buildup of forex reserves in the early 50s. And so with that buildup of forex reserves was an initial early attempt at liberalization, right? And very soon, about I think as early as 1956, there were things. I mean, things happened. The forex reserves started dwindling. We obviously did not see the kind of growth in industries because of, as I said, in parallel the industrial policy. We didn't see a growth in industries which could export, etc. And suddenly we became conservative again, and so there was backtracked, right? So the OGL list, which I'll speak about quite a bit, which is called the Open General License, sorry, was basically a list of things that you could import without a license, right? And this list was a relic of our, of the British period. And unfortunately, that is one thing that we decided to carry forward with full gusto, and in fact, we worsened it, right? So this OGL list was the defining kind of list, which was at the heart of the import licensing system. So the items which were on the Open General License list, you could import without any kind of restrictions. I mean, I say this very lightly. There was a lot of restrictions that came, but relatively speaking, was easier to kind of import if the item was on that list. But otherwise, it was an absolute nightmare to kind of import, right? So the curation of this OGL list was, it kind of went up and down in terms of, how many items were there. So in periods of relative liberalization, you would see that the OGL list expanded. So there were more items that you could import freely without a license. And in times of contraction, it would suddenly get pruned. I mean, it would get pruned quite a bit, and there would be only few items in this OGL list. So this happened. So in the 50s, there was that expansion and contraction. 1966, for instance, there was the first devaluation that happened, right? So in remember, again, for context, for people who might not be familiar, and I don't blame you at all if you're not, India was on a fixed exchange rate system, and so the rupee was pegged to the pound, right, at a fixed exchange rate. And obviously this fixed exchange rate was highly overvalued. And so what that meant was that we were artificially inflating or increasing the value of the rupee by government diktat rather than actual market forces, right? Now, why would this was done is an entirely different podcast by itself, right? For some reason, in the early part of, the post-war kind of period, so between 50s and 80s or so on, many developing countries felt that the exchange rate was a matter of pride, that having a kind of high exchange rate rather than a low one was a matter of national pride.
That happens even now.
it happens to even now, maybe to a slightly lesser extent. But yeah, I mean, for some reason, there are many people who correlate your exchange rate with economic growth, with national pride, with a whole bunch of things which it actually has no connection with. And so the result of that is that many countries would keep an artificially high exchange rate. So the rupee was pegged to the to the pound, and at an extremely high artificially high rate, right? So I'm going to use dollar because very quickly then we switch over from pegging to the pound to the dollar. But to give you an idea, the rupee was pegged at 4.76 per dollar, right? To and whereas actually it was probably about 10 rupees to the dollar. So this was a massive undervaluation, I mean, overvaluation of the rupee, right? So in 1966, you saw that first kind of devaluation of the rupee. It was devalued from officially from 4.76 to the dollar to about, I think, 7.5 to the dollar, which probably was a devaluation of about 57 percent in nominal terms. In real terms, about 30% or so. Real terms is just counting for inflation. So that was the first thing. But crucially, along with that devaluation, you also had again a few steps of liberalization. So the OGL list was again expanded. Some of the strict export and import controls were suspended for some time, etc. But the devaluation at that time was highly unpopular, right? So again, this thing about the exchange rate and national pride came in. People said this is India being humiliated in the world scene, etc., etc. Lots of random things, and so it was highly unpopular. And some of that, again, you take this devaluation along with the easing of imports, which meant that obviously protectionism would go down. So the industries were crying hoarse, people were crying hoarse. It became unpopular, and then before you know it, it was all snapped back, right? So this I mean, you have to, I'm sorry if I'm dragging this out, and please stop me, but you have to also look at this at a time of global state. So from 1966 to, you take the next 5-6 year period where, as I said, things were slowly liberalizing. But you had the 1971 war with Pakistan, and then you had the Bangladesh thing and so on. But what happened at that point of time was that US famously started supported Pakistan at that point of time, and also cut off some part of foreign aid to India. So at this point of time, when India was hurt by the United States, and then you're depreciating, and then you're liberalizing trade, it just didn't fly. So it was the most popular thing to again snap back, revert back on all the kind of liberalizing reforms that happened, unfortunately, and it became tighter than ever. So you had extremely strict liberal controls. I mean, sorry, import controls post that kind of 1971.
Yeah. So Anupam, let's look at the trade policies, right? How these existed and how they panned out. But what we'll do is we'll take a short break, and when we are back, we'll discuss the trade policies as they existed back then and how things panned out. Yeah. So we are back. So Anupam, can you elaborate on the trade policies that existed back then and how all these things panned out?
Yeah. So essentially, as I said, there was the two pillars of our trade policy, right? One was the import licensing system, and the other was the tariffs system. So let's take that import. Uh, the non-tariff barriers or the import licensing system was the predominant way or tool of protectionism for the Indian government. So these controls included a whole bunch of things. So as I mentioned, the OGL and the import licensing system was one of it. I won't go into much more detail about that, but there were others, right? There's something called canalization, which is essentially that certain category of goods could only be imported by public sector agencies. Others were not given permission to do so. That was one form of, again, protectionism, right? Then there was something called the actual user policy. So this is a fun one. Basically, this meant that, if you were a firm which wanted to import something, you had to prove that you were the end user, that you were not importing it to, well, distribute to somebody else, to sell it to somebody else. Now, why this mattered? Again, you wanted control. You wanted control on who's using what, and you wanted to, obviously, if you had distributors, it would make the system more efficient. And you didn't want efficiency in imports. You wanted tighter controls on imports, and so therefore you had an end user policy. right? Then there was something called phase manufacturing program. And again, this is ridiculous, but it said that if you were an manufacturing business and you said that you wanted, let's say, a license to import a few goods which acted as an intermediary good into your final product, right? So some kind of raw material, some kind of maybe machines to import, sorry, to finally use in manufacturing process, you would be given a license, but you had to make a commitment to the government that in the next 5 years or so, you'll either find a domestic alternative or you will start manufacturing those intermediate goods yourself.
Okay.
So it was just basically you would get a license, but for a very brief period until you found alternative solutions. Now, imagine this, right? If you were, for example, a car manufacturer, forget a car manufacturer. If you were a manufacturer of watches, you rely on a lot of other components, right? From the, I don't know, the small levers, gears, etc. that go into it, from to the steel, etc. All of it. So, watch manufacturer was essentially you had to find a domestic alternative, or you had to manufacture steel yourself. Imagine how stupid that is.
I
Right?
think you have mentioned one example, right? Tata's venture into this, and yeah, they found.
Oh, so let's go into that. That's a funny one. So Tatas were essentially trying to manufacture trucks, right? And that's what they were good at. And but the idea was to manufacture that trucks and to look at and plan it out and design those things. You needed a special type of pen. You need special type of paper, right? The architectural kind of paper and pen, etc. Now, those were not available in India. You had to import those, but the ministry didn't like giving permission to import those, right? And so Tata's initially spent so much money on importing, from through bribes, through various other things, official channels, etc. Spent so much money on importing that the cost of a truck was equivalent to the cost of the pen that you imported to design that truck. Okay, so this was the kind of really weird scenarios that you would find.
Yeah, these all go against the concepts of comparative advantage, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's exactly opposite to the ideas of comparative advantage and specialization and division of labor, all of those things, right? So, economic principles would get take a massive backseat. So those were that was the phased manufacturing programs, and then of course you had government purchase preferences. Government would only purchase from domestic manufacturers. So even if you had an foreign alternative which would be 10x cheaper, the government wouldn't purchase from them, right? And that's just, again, it's highly inefficient kind of systems. So this was the idea, right? And now look at that. As I said, that the entire OGL system was massive bureaucratic undertaking. So what goes into that OGL, what goes out of it, and remember, this is not an easy task, right? So for example, when you say okay, we'll put pen into the OGL, then what about pencil? And then what kind of pen? Is it the fountain pen? Is it the ballpoint pen? Is it, and then that would become a massive bureaucratic undertaking. For those familiar at least with how, the kind of problems associated with the GST Council now in terms of classification and categorization of goods, that imagine that, but at a much higher level into this, right? So, if you were a firm which you wanted to import, you would have to submit an application to the entire bureaucratic system. They would take it up on a case by case basis. There's no overall rule, which meant immediately that there's a lot of delay. So once you submitted, you had to first prove that you're the end user. Then you had to, the onus was on you as a firm to prove that there are no domestic alternatives, right? And imagine how difficult it is to prove that. How do you prove that the non-existence of something? It's easy to prove the existence of something, but you have to prove the non-existence of something, right? Which is bizarre. Then you had to prove that what you're importing is essential. And I'm using air quotes of essential because, again, this is a highly subjective term. What is essential to you might not be an essential to a bureaucrat, right? But you had to prove that this was essential. Next, you had to get basically you had to say that you're the end user, you're not going to resell it, etc. So you had to prove a number of things, many of those things which were subjective by nature, which meant all of this was just ripe for rent seeking, massive corruption, massive rent seeking, a lot of things under the table, etc.
So one thing that that a thought that comes to my mind is this. You have to prove that a substitute doesn't exist or something like that, right? So imagine a scenario where someone just comes up and says that, okay, no, I have a substitute. I have that alternative. That it indirectly creates, it creates those powers, not power, I don't know, some vested interests can be there who can easily stall. If you want to become an entrepreneur, they can easily come and stall your whatever
Yeah,
efforts you want to put.
absolutely. You can imagine a Hindi movie scenario where a single citizen can take down an entire large enterprise by just going and saying, "I'm manufacturing something." So this happened, by the way. So if you're curious, so many of you might not know this, and at least it took me by surprise. But Airtel, which is owned by Bharti Communications, and started by Sunil Mittal, right? So Bharti actually started off as just importing different items and distributing them. One of their first assignments was to import power generators.
Hmm.
Okay, and so they were importing. You can imagine that there was massive amounts of power cuts in India, and some people wanted generators. So Bharti would import these generators from Suzuki, right? Which were seen to be reliable and so on. And there was massive demand for these things. He made a killing. I mean, it was quite a profitable enterprise. And then suddenly, one day, his import license gets cancelled.
Hmm.
And the reason? Yeah, two people came up to the government and said, I'm manufacturing those generators now. They had not even a plan to manufacture those generators, by the way. There was no capital. They didn't have a factory. They didn't have anything. They just said that we have a plan to manufacture generators, and immediately this guy's license gets cancelled. So, you see again how bizarre this is, right? There was no check on whether they're actually manufacturing the generator. What is the price of that generator? Sometimes you could have, let's say there's actually manufactured, but it's 15x more expensive. Yet you had to buy that 15x more expensive thing because it was, well, domestic.
Hmm.
Right, and there was no thing about quality. For example, the other example is of a manufacturer who wanted to produce iron boxes, right, electric irons, and so for that electric iron you need very thin sheets of iron,
Hmm.
okay, which were not manufactured in India. So he would get an import license from that. But the government said, wait a minute, we are producing iron and steel. Why are you importing this? You have to use domestic iron. Now, the domestic iron was extremely heavy by nature, which meant that, the final product, nobody could lift that iron box. And yet they were forced to use that iron if you were selling domestically. But if you were exporting, you could import. So all kinds of really, again, bizarre rules, right?
So many bizarre rules. Just imagine the plight of those who would want to start business or who want to run business, right? They have to focus on everything apart from their own businesses.
Which is why nobody wanted to start a business, and so thus, which explains the extremely middling growth, the lack of entrepreneurship. And I would like to believe that we are seeing a lot of those legacy issues now. If someone would say that the entrepreneurial spirit in India is kind of, you know is not as high, a lot of it goes back to our early years. There is a part dependence. Because at that stage, if you had, so who could be a businessman? You could only be a businessman if you had political connections, if you had a lot of money, or if you were absolutely a hustler. Now, none of these were, what you would say as noble things, right? So, as kids, you were actively encouraged not to think of business as a profession at all, right? You'd say become a doctor, become an engineer, but not a businessman, because businessmen were seen to be akin to crooks. Because you had to be a crook to get through the system. There's no way you could live honestly, right? And so generations after generations were dissuaded from being an entrepreneur. I know this is a massive diversion, but were dissuaded from being an entrepreneur because
They have to do bunch of
they have
these
to
things.
become a crook in order to survive. And nobody wanted
In
that.
fact, you mentioned that there used to be industrial embassies.
Yeah. So the only way that industries could survive is that, this was very funny, but in Delhi, where near the bureaucrats, the entire industrial licensing system and so on, you would have a whole host of, well, industrial embassies. So every single firm that had any hopes and plans of becoming big had to set up an embassy house in Delhi so that they could constantly keep in touch with the bureaucrats. And it was seen that a businessman would spend more time at the government office than in his boardroom or in her boardroom, right? Because that was the state of affairs. So you spent an enormous amount of time, effort, energy, money in trying to get these licenses, in persuading, and when I say persuading, I mean in all forms, using either power or money or whatever, but in persuading the bureaucrat to, let's say, include the item that you want into that OGL list, right? And so it was all of this lobbying done, which was a massive waste of time.
Also, reducing the tariff, I guess.
Reducing the tariffs, of course. You could try and say, categorize this good as a essential so that there would be lesser tariffs or lesser auxiliary tariffs or lesser countervailing duty or whatever, right? So it was just a massive
Just think
exercise.
about the opportunity cost for all these things,
Exactly.
right? Yeah. So, but thing is, in 1991, right, you initiated the reforms. The Narasimha Rao government, they initiated the reforms, and again, they did things quite immediately, so as to say, or all these things happen over a very short period of time, which implies that somewhere the known solutions existed. Now, if the known solutions existed and you knew that there was a problem, why did you wait for the crisis, right? So sometimes you have the solutions but they don't get implemented, and this is one of those scenarios. So why do you what does this imply? What is the what do we have any learnings when it comes to our political economy here?
Yeah. So in 91, as you said, there was a lot of reforms that happened nearly overnight. I mean, firstly, for example, there was the devaluation of the rupee massive devaluation of the rupee. It happened in two stages. Many parts of that import licensing system were dismantled. The OGL list was removed overnight. So all of these things were done in a jiffy, really, right? And so it was very tempting then for most of us, looking back, to think that why couldn't this have been done in the 80s? Why couldn't this have been done in the 70s or 60s and so on? But there's obviously, as I said, a combination of factors that prevented us from taking. So, first, as I said, we took an ideological stance. The government very clearly took an ideological stance, whether it was Nehru to some extent, but Indira Gandhi to a much larger extent. There was a very deep distrust of private enterprise, which is very clear to see. I mean, in all of the things. So, I know there's a lot of the practical political economy that played out, and we'll get to that. But at the beginning of it, that there was an ideological kind of aversion to capitalism, to free enterprise, and so on. And I think that was kind of clear to see in the series of policy measures that were taken by different kind of governments and different leaders throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? So that is part A. Part B, even at times when there was that little bit of liberalization that was done, as I said, first in the 50s, there was in the 60s, some efforts in the 70s, and much larger efforts in the 80s. It was quite unpopular. Now, when I say it was quite unpopular, it was unpopular amongst some of the elite. And these were the elite that obviously benefited greatly from the existing status quo system. And this is always why change doesn't happen, right? I mean, it's not
Yeah.
particular to India or anywhere. By the way, this was a lot of developing countries found themselves in the same boat. It's not that India was particularly unique in this. A lot of developing countries distrusted private enterprises. A lot of developing countries, especially post-colonial kind of developing countries, also really did not want to devalue their currency. And so, therefore, went after looking at foreign exchange preservation more than a devaluation. I'll come to this. It's a very important point, really, in all of this, right? But as I said, there will be the elite. So famously, I mean, many of you would know this, the Bombay Plan, which was, the government got together a whole bunch of industrialists and so on. And the industrialists are always the ones that will, this might seem paradoxical, but if you think about it, it's absolutely intuitive, right? The industrialists will always bat for more protection.
Hmm. This is
Right?
coming from you, by the way.
Yeah, but this is what will happen, because you're the top industry. You alone you almost have a monopoly power. Why would you not bat for protection? I mean, this is goes back to our Bastiat's saying, right? The candle makers will ask for protection from the sun.
Yeah, yeah.
Why not? I mean, you will, because if you've got deep entrenched interests, you will do anything to protect that interest. So, and these are the industrialists who also I mean, making a controversial statement here, but these are the industrialists who would also do political donations. So, and so on. So, if you looked at, again, that Bombay Plan, which is a whole bunch of industrialists actively said that the way to grow Indian industry is by protecting Indian industry.
Okay.
Right? And so for protecting from foreign competition. So that's why you had all of these things, right? Your small and medium enterprises, cottage industry protection plan. You had, this entire thing about protectionism, tariffs. Even within, you wouldn't let any industry grow too big. The famous whatever happened with the Bajaj scooters and so on, right? So all of this is tied together in that this thing. And then there's the bureaucrats. Bureaucrats also didn't want to let go of that power because that curation, as I've said before, that curation of that OGL list, the curation of and categorization of goods into this thing gave you enormous power. And with that power, obviously comes, well, ways to take advantage of that power, right? And so a lot of bureaucrats got, well, extremely rich while designing import duties. Not just at that level, but at that smaller level, a customs duty officer who would basically go through what is being imported became extraordinarily rich. So all of them had a vested interest in maintaining status quo. Right? So that, I think, partly explains. So that ideological bent, industrialist and your bureaucrats benefiting from the system, and then, you had a political economy landscape where certain leaders were extremely popular, all of that, right? You didn't have a real good opposition to Congress. Indira Gandhi then did all of that emergency, a whole bunch of things. I don't want to get into all of that now, but again, but yet they were not punished in the elections. So, Indians were whatever happy with, not happy really, but were okay with that situation.
Yeah,
So,
this explains to a large extent, right, why we didn't have the reforms before. Also, the point that you mentioned about industrialists, they having their own interest over there. So this debate about being pro business or pro market, that continues even now,
exactly,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
So many of the things that we did back then, or many of the things that happened back then, from there, I think we have some learnings for the present scenario. So how can we connect some of the problems that we have right now with things that happened pre 1991? What are your top policy lessons, key policy lessons?
I would start with, for me, the scariest bit is that reversion to the pre 1991 thinking and mindset, right? About we are again. So, according to me, this wave of protectionism across countries will always come about when you are facing an economic downturn. And it's at times of peril that you always tend to look inwards, right? This is true globally. You look at the global financial crisis and what happened, you tend to look inwards, as in at least you look at what, Brexit, Trump, all of those things are explained by, partly at least by the economic downturn. And in India as well, I mean, we went in a particular direction politically, and I that for me has its bearings in the 2012-13 um, stagflation episode, which is in a way a delayed kind of result of your 2009 crisis, 2007 crisis. But nonetheless, let's come to present day, and you look at, again, we are going through economic turmoil. India was slowing down well before the pandemic with 4.5% GDP growth. Pandemic hit, -6%, -7% GDP growth. Obviously, things are not looking up. Our economic recovery is taking much longer than what we wanted. Our capital markets are in a mess. Investments are slowing down, etc., etc., etc. Right now, there could be genuine reforms. You could do large scale labor reforms. You could really fix the banking system. You could do a whole bunch of things. But instead, again, we are looking towards that, as I said, that pre-91 mindset, right? We are talking increasingly about Swadeshi. We're talking about Atmanirbhar. We're talking about Make in India. We're PLI schemes. All of these are highly protectionist policies. All of these are reversing the gains that we made. I mean, unfortunately, we didn't have enough time to look at that kind of trade policy from 91 up till 2020. And there have been lots of, ups and downs. As I've said, after that big bang 91 reforms, there's not been a lot of reforms. I mean, there's been incremental reforms, right? FDI you raise the limit of FDI in one particular sector, let's say insurance from 26% to 49%, in banking from 49% to something else percent, in defense from 49 to 72, etc. Right? So, I mean, these are good. But these are incremental changes that have happened over a 30-year period. I mean, all of this had to happen in the first decade, if you ask me. But unfortunately, it's taken, over 30 years to come to wherever we were. But very unfortunately, in the last 3-4 years, you're seeing that again, that going back to those things, right? So you're seeing an increase in tariffs across the board on electronic items. You're seeing an increase in tariffs on many products, and then you're seeing selective bans of certain products. I mean, some of them have a geopolitical tint to them, with China and so on. But nonetheless, it's this thing. There's lots of countervailing duties. India is probably the top levier of countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties. Some of them are legitimate. A lot of them are made up. I mean, there's where there's no dumping, but you still put an anti-dumping duty. We've selectively made life extremely difficult for foreign investors, whether it's Amazon or Walmart. We favor domestic manufacturers or domestic industries like Reliance and so on. Sometimes it's very brazen as well, right? So all of this tells me that we are again heading in a protectionist stance and highly protectionist stance at a time when, India is best served by a free trade global economy. I mean, the global economy is also going that way. Make no mistake. I mean, Trump's trade wars and so on. But India had that opportunity to be that lone star who could stand out and say, we'll be that guardians of a liberal world order. But we didn't. It was very easy to buckle under and say, Trump is doing this, let's also do this, right? And so that's a kind of unfortunate turn of events where there's some, again, encouraging signs. It's always never all bad, right? There's some encouraging events. I mean, we made that trade deal with Australia, for instance, which is good. It came out of, I think, a very natural kind of joint interest and so on. Now we're planning to join the IPAF. But we also, stepped out of RCEP. So there's always this good and bad. But unfortunately, I think at the moment, there's more protectionist moves, more anti-trade moves rather than liberalizing moves, if you look at it on an aggregate level. So for me, that is highly disheartening that we've not learned the lessons from the pre-91 period. I'm just talking about trade. There's, beyond trade on many other aspects in terms of, even industrial licensing and so on. I think we should really relook at that policies. We should look at, what were the reforms not done in 91 that we should be doing now. Again, goes back to land, labor, capital markets, all of those things, right? We still don't have capital account convertibility, for instance. All of these things, I think we have to really look at how can we reform this going ahead, because India is best served. And as that episode shows, right, extremely low, middling growth, terrible productivity, etc. up till 91. If you read that paper, I've kind of highlighted the massive amount of productivity gains, the massive amounts of wage growth, right? Income growth of people, the profit, of course, growth of profits, the higher entrepreneurial activity, employment opportunities, all of these things. I mean, everything that you consider holy and good increased and bettered after 91 reforms. That alone should tell you that it's a no-brainer to keep reforming.
Okay, so I think with this thought, we should wrap up this episode. Thank you, Anupam, for all these detailed insights into how things were and what we should learn from this. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
Thanks.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.